Family, so good to be with you again on this Wednesday as we pick back up in our midweek Bible study. Sorry we missed last week. I got busy with some things and just didn't get around to it, but we are picking back up in our study of Jesus's words in the Sermon on the Mount. And actually, we come to the end of our study of Jesus's teachings there in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And today and tomorrow, as we close out our study, I really want to try and wrap up the essence of what we've looked at over the last several months and what it is that Jesus is saying as he brings this really landmark teaching to a close. Now, as we've talked about throughout this study, when it comes to Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, so much of it goes back to his words in Matthew chapter 4, verse 17, when he shows up and he proclaims, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near." And when Jesus says that, he's not just talking about heaven as in that place that you go to after you die, but rather when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven coming near, he's talking about the rule and the reign and the power of God coming near on the earth through him. And so everything that he talks to us about in the Sermon on the Mount is built on that foundation, that he's trying to show us what it looks like to live in his kingdom and to live that kind of life that he calls us to live. And then in Matthew chapter 7, verses 13 through 29, the end of Jesus' teaching, he brings all of it to a close by telling us really the one non-negotiable that you and I have, and that that we have to understand when it comes to living the life that he calls us to live, living life in God's kingdom. It's the climax of the message, and Jesus minces no words. So Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 13. He says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, and a bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus by their fruit you will recognize them. Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons and perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.' Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. You and I live in a culture that celebrates and even idolizes the American value of the freedom of choice. For example, I love coffee. I love good coffee. And so just consider, if you will, the average or typical coffee shop. I guess average is another word, but typical coffee shop. In a quest to offer a uniquely satisfying and personal experience, you have a choice of so many different things. For example, you have a variety of different beans that you can choose from. You have a variety of different countries from where the beans are grown. You have a variety of different types of roast. You have light roast or medium roast or dark roast or somewhere in between those roasts. But picking a bean is only the first step. Next, you have to decide on a specific coffee drink that you want. Ristretto, espresso, lungo, cafe crema, macchiato, cappuccino, flat white, cafe au lait, Turkish coffee, Americano, long black, mocha, cafe latte, frappe, Irish coffee. Then comes the milk, full fat, semi-skimmed, skimmed, lactose-free, soy, almond, oat, rice milk. The list just goes on and on. I read somewhere that Starbucks has proudly advertises a choice of 80,000 different drink combinations. And I think Clara's on the River here in Battle Creek has about that many items on their menu. So speaking of choices, you can add that to the list. That may be an exaggeration, but I think it's somewhere in the vicinity of that, or at least it sure does seem like it. Or think about our TVs and what we watch. I mean, first of all, there are countless providers. You've got satellite TV or cable TV or streaming options, Netflix, Disney Plus, Hulu. The list goes on and on. And on top of that, it seems like there are just limitless numbers of channels that you can get on your TV, even though we watch like 5% of them, if that. We live in a culture that celebrates freedom of choice. Interestingly, though, sometimes too many choices can actually be a debilitating thing. Research shows that more often than not, while people are drawn to more choices when it comes to a particular product, people actually buy a product more frequently when they are presented with fewer choices. Research also shows that an excess of choices often leads us to be not more satisfied, but actually less satisfied once we actually decide. That's why we call it buyer's remorse, right? There's often that nagging feeling that we could have done better. And I think we've all experienced those things where you have so many choices that you either just don't decide on anything, you're frozen into not deciding on anything, or when you do decide on something, you start worrying and wondering if you made the right choice and if what you didn't choose is better than what you did choose. Nonetheless, again, we live in a culture that celebrates our freedom to choose. And that freedom in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, nor is it something that we should take for granted either. And yet, while I appreciate living in a culture where we have that much freedom of choice, I think we also need to be a little bit wary of it, because there are spiritual hazards that come with that freedom. And the truth is that a lot of us as Americans, and even us as believers, are so caught up in that culture of the freedom of choice that we often think that we're entitled to it, that it's our right. And even more than that, if we live long enough in that idea of having all of these choices, we begin to think that this freedom of choice also means that I'm free to choose the consequences of my choices, or even free from the consequences altogether. But the truth is, we're not. Make no mistake about it. You and I have a freedom of choice, but we're not free from the consequences of our choices, or free to choose the consequences of our choices. And therein lies so much of the pain in people's lives in our culture today, because having the freedom of choice does not mean that I have the freedom to choose the consequences of my choice. That's why I like what one writer said when he said, "Begin nothing without considering what the end may be." Because the wisest choices in life tend to be made by keeping the end in mind. And so here in this last section of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus wraps up the whole sermon with the clear call to choose to embrace him, to choose to live the life, his life, the kind of life that he calls us to live, to choose to live under the kingship and the lordship of God, and to do it with the end in mind. And to help us see that idea, Jesus gives us four pictures, four contrasts of what he's talking about. And each picture essentially says the same thing and points us in the same direction. And I think we find that direction in verse 24, where Jesus says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who builds his house on the rock." Now, you've probably heard me say this before. When you see that word, therefore, that's a clue to us that what's just been said is being connected to what is about to be said. When you see that word therefore, think, what's it there for? That what is just said is about to be connected to what is about to be said. And so here Jesus is connecting the previous three pictures that he talked about in the passage I just read, or contrast, if you will, to the fourth picture of the wise and foolish builders. And all four pictures are centered around this idea of hearing Jesus's words and putting them into practice. So we're going to look at the first two pictures today, and then we'll look at the last two pictures tomorrow. So let's go ahead and go and look at the first picture, the narrow and wide roads that Jesus gives in verses 13 and 14. The narrow road, Jesus says, leads to life, and the wide road leads to destruction. So what's the narrow road and what's the wide road? Well, very simply, the narrow road stands for the path of hearing Jesus's words and putting them into practice. The wide road, then, stands for basically everything else, including knowing the words of Jesus and not putting them into practice. And so hearing Jesus' words and putting them into practice is the difference between the narrow road and the wide road. Now, when you think about it, something that's narrow, when you think about something that's narrow, we typically think of kind of a tight space. There's not a lot of wiggle room, might even be constrictive at times. Doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but it's just tight. It's constrictive. And when I think back to Jesus' words that we've studied over the last few months, how many of us have felt that way with some of the things and some of the ways that he calls us to live? I know I have. I don't know how you can't walk through Jesus's teachings and not feel like there's some really, really hard stuff in there when you look at all that he has to say about anger and marriage and integrity and turning the other cheek and going the extra mile and loving our enemies and not doing things to be seen by others, and with what he has to say about money and worry and judging others, and the list just goes on and on. There's a lot of tough stuff in there. And I think it becomes very clear that if we're going to live the life that Jesus has called us to live, there's not enough room for our will and his will. Something's got to give. And putting these words of Jesus into practice will eventually squeeze out my will and my agenda. It won't fit through the narrow gate. But in the end, it's the narrow gate that ultimately leads to life. On the other hand, the wide gate, it's nice and roomy and spacious. It's easy to enter. There's plenty of room for my will and my agenda to fit right in, even alongside his will. But in the end, it's the wide gate that ultimately leads to destruction. And again, the difference between the narrow gate and the wide gate is hearing the words of Jesus and putting them into practice. It's not just hearing the words of Jesus. It's not even just knowing the words of Jesus. It's putting Jesus's words into practice in our lives. You can know the words of Jesus forward and backward. You can attend church every time the doors are open, and yet you can still be headed for destruction, heading down the wide road toward the wide gate, because the words of Jesus aren't making a difference in how you live your life. Jesus then moves to a second picture, one of true and false prophets, in verses 15 through 20. Jesus says in verse 16 that you will recognize the difference between the two by the fruit that their lives produce. So what does their fruit look like? Well, it looks like the kind of fruit that Jesus has been talking about throughout the Sermon on the Mount. Now, understand that nobody's perfect, okay? But if you've got a leader or a person of influence who speaks in the name of Jesus, but they live a life that's an angry life. They're consumed with lust. They look to discard their spouse at the first hint of displeasure. They lack integrity. They seek revenge at all costs. They don't love their enemies. They give and pray and fast to be seen by others. They're consumed with money and the worries associated with it. They're rife with being judgmental and condemning towards others. If you've got a leader or a person of influence who has that kind of fruit hanging from their tree, Jesus says chances are they're more false than true, because they've got a life that obviously isn't putting Jesus's words into practice. And far too often, those false prophets can lead us toward the wide gate and down the wide road because they themselves are going through it by the way they're living their lives. And truth be told, if we're just honest, sometimes in our worst moments, we don't mind a false prophet every now and then, because we'd much rather have people tell us what we want to hear and give an endorsement on the way we want to live rather than to challenge us. Because far too often, we'd rather change God into our image than be changed into his. So those are the first two pictures that Jesus gives us, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow as we wrap up our lesson by looking at the last two pictures, and then I'll have a couple of final thoughts for you on what Jesus says and kind of the whole overarching themes of what's going on in the Sermon on the Mount. So I hope you have a blessed day, and I hope you'll join us tomorrow. God bless.